I'm here with Lord Norman Foster, who built one of the great architecture and engineering firms, Foster and Partners, as well as the Norman Foster Foundation. So, Norman, perhaps we can start with some of the issues facing us today by looking back in time. You started your practice in the 1960s at a time when young people were focused on the war in Vietnam, civil rights, women's rights, and the environment. Today, there are simultaneous stresses that are comparable in many ways. Of course, the pandemic, we see civil unrest, depression level unemployment, and the impact of climate change is revealed by the fires in California. What did you learn from that time that might be relevant to us today?
Kent, the period that you're talking about was also significant in two other respects. It was the Cold War. You really did not know whether you were going to wake up in the morning. You know, the world could be annihilated. I mean, we lived with that, and it's very easy to forget it. That was a threat. I mean, look at films like Dr. Strangelove of that period, which mirror that extraordinary uncertainty. It was also the birth of what we now call the Green Movement. It hadn't been called that then, but you had writers like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, talking about the chemicals that could destroy the biosphere. You had Buckminster Fuller with his Guide to Spaceship Earth. So it was the two opposites. The optimism about the future of the planet, but the warning signs about its fragility, and also the imminent threat. So there are parallels.
Well, you mentioned Buckminster Fuller, and I think you started working with him in 1968. Of course, he was one of the great visionaries of our time. How did that experience alter the way you think about design?
We came together out of a shared sympathy, awareness. In the late 60s, we were into recycling buildings that would breathe, that would reduce energy, that would admit sunlight. All of these were precursors to the Green Movement. And Bucky, of course, arguably was the first green architect in the sense that he drew attention to the fragility of the planet. So his view was far more all-encompassing and came from a great depth of knowledge and awareness. It was a profound influence, one of many influences.
Well, let's talk about cities. Many people are speculating about what cities will be in the future. And looking at articles in the press, they seem to fall into three general camps. So one, some people think the cities are obsolete. If you can work anywhere, you can live anywhere, why do we need cities? Second camp argues that once we have the vaccine and immunity, everything will quickly go back to normal. And a third camp says that all of the fragilities and inequities that have been revealed by the pandemic will prompt us to make cities more resilient and vibrant. So what do you think the future of cities will be?
I think I'm coming from a fourth camp, which is closer to your last category. The trends which were already apparent will be accelerated, will be magnified. And the story of cities is the story of crises. I mean, the cholera outbreak, which killed thousands in London, technology came to the rescue in terms of sanitation, modern sanitation as we know it. The Thames as a river was an open sewer. It was also an opportunity to create some beautiful elements of London that we take for granted today. The Thames embankment, underground public transport, all of these were spawned by that. So if that was London in the middle of the 19th century, it could be Chicago with the Great Fire, which heralded fireproof construction, high rise. It could be the earthquake of Lisbon, which ushered in anti-seismic structures. It could be the Great Fire of London, which set the DNA of London as we know it. I mean, the Victoria, the Georgian terrace, the brick party walls, the recess windows. So the story of cities is a story of crises and of rebirth and regeneration.
So, what positive things do you see happening today that may be the direct result of the pandemic?
Go to Soho now, I mean, entire streets are no longer for traffic, they're for people.
Yeah, I'm aware of a city in Europe that finished their 10-year plan to transform streets for cars into streets for bikes and pedestrians just this year.
It's incredible. I mean, the, the predicted growth of the e-bike was 3 years. That growth of 3 years has happened in 3 months. So the renaissance of the bicycle again has been magnified.
Well, let's talk about resilience. So, resilience is usually defined as a system that can bend when stressed and not break, or sometimes get stronger, like when you exercise muscles. What do you think is necessary to create a more resilient city?
I think it's the ability of the built environment, the infrastructure, which, if you like, is the urban glue that binds together the individual buildings. So if that infrastructure is adaptable, and the individual buildings are adaptable, then changes of use, changes of work pattern, the ultimate sustainable building is one that can be recycled rather than being demolished. So, so infrastructure and buildings which can adapt to change.
Well, let's talk about adaptation. So, almost instantly with the lockdown, homes became centers of work as offices were closed, became centers of learning, schools were closed, healthcare, medical offices were closed, exercise gyms were closed. Should we fundamentally rethink how we design the home to accommodate this wider range of activities?
Well, I think there are two ways that you can confront some of those realities. One is obviously by more space, in a traditional sense, let's say more rooms. So you've got the luxury of going to another room, having some privacy, but not everybody can necessarily have that luxury. So that, I think, leads to how you use the space. And I also know some of the research work that you and your unit have been doing in terms of how you use space. And it is possible with the technology that we have at our disposal to be able to reconfigure smaller spaces so that they work better at different times of the day. So we're not talking about static spaces, but we're talking about interactive elements, walls which can move, storage units which can reverse themselves and reveal other work surfaces. But all of this is really about change to improve the quality of life, the quality of living. And that is really at the core what design is about. It's about the quality of life. It's a means to an end. It's a means of improving the quality of life and learning from the crises which cyclically, I mean, this will not be in the lifetime of so many people who will be seeing this. This will not be the only crisis that they're going to live through.
So, we've talked a bit about how buildings could become more resilient. How can we make communities more resilient?
We see the problems of wildfires in California, 2.5 million people without power. We see the shortfalls of the big centralized power grids. So the idea that communities could be much more autonomous is, I think, another big pattern. And again, the pandemic, I think, has hastened this. Trade will continue in some respects to be global, but it will also be more local. So you don't have the kind of Rust Belt consequences of globalization, which impacts the local community.
Well, the theme of this summit, as you know, is the power of without, imagining a world without increasingly obsolete centralized infrastructure and with more lightweight responsive systems, ideas that you and I have talked about at length. How can these concepts address the great long-term challenge of our era, which is climate change?
You can't address climate change without concerted, unified global action. But you can make a lot of things locally and avoid a lot of the blockages of the big supply chains. Whether that's drugs that are made in one country or flowers which are grown in another country. So I think this tendency to be able to have sanitation without sewers, to have power without power stations or power lines, to have meat without animals, to have produce without soil. Again, all of these tendencies are here. With time, they'll be magnified. They will be taken for granted in a way that we take so many things for granted, which didn't exist in terms of our grandparents.
So, Norman, maybe one last question. Many people today are very frustrated by the problems they see all around them, the inequities, the racism, anti-science, political dysfunction. What advice do you have for those who feel that the old should just be thrown out and replaced with something better?
I have to say that if you take the arc of history and you see the progress, notwithstanding the threats which are continuous, then surely you build on the best of the past, and you celebrate those achievements, and you add to that the passion of youth, the ability to be able to improve, to do things, to transform, to challenge, to question. But above all, surely you build on the best of the past.
So, Norman, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for joining us at this City Science Summit, Guadalajara.